In the late 19th century, the United States saw a boom in immigrants. Around 11.7 immigrants came to the United States between 1871 and 1901, which is more immigrants than had come in total going back to 1607 and the founding of Jamestown under British rule. By the time we came to the start of the 20th century, the United States population was 76.2 million in 1900. Between 1900 and 1914, the United States saw another boom of immigrants, when another 12.9 million new immigrants arrived. These turn-of-the-century immigrants came primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, and were largely Italians, Jews, and Poles. The immigrants that came during this time were usually escaping hardship of some kind. While their reasons varied, they were all searching for a better life and new opportunities in America. These new European immigrants varied from previous waves of European immigration. The immigrants who came around the late 19th and early 20th century were from different parts of Europe than we had seen before, and with that brought with them different cultures, religions, and political beliefs to the United States. One reason immigrants coming to America had always traditionally come was escaping the tough economic times in Europe. Early on in our nation's history, most immigrants that settled here came from Western European countries: Britain, Scotland, France, Germany, and the Scandinavian areas. They had come in pretty steady quantities early on in our nation's history. The mass migration from Western Europe had started in the 1840s, when more than 1 million Irish immigrants fled a terrible famine, often referred to as the Irish Potato Famine. In the following decades, Europe's population grew rapidly. Its cities became severely overcrowded, and agriculture became commercialized, wreaking havoc on the peasant economies of Europe. The change to commercial agriculture displaced millions across Europe. First, it impacted Germans and Scandinavians, then it moved across Austria, Hungary, Russia, Italy, and then finally the Balkans. Some of the displaced rural workers went to work in the mines and factories of Europe, while others immigrated to South America and the United States. The shift to commercial agriculture and the economic hardships it caused on the peasant class of Europe is an example of one of the main factors that pushed immigrants towards coming to the United States. It had caused unemployment, starvation, and it had pushed the poor in Europe to search for greater economic opportunity here in the U.S. Other factors that pushed immigrants out of Europe was the overcrowding of European cities. Europe had already gone through its Industrial Revolution, and cities had become overcrowded as more and more of the poor working class took jobs in the growing factory system within the urban areas. Some immigrants also came to escape political and religious persecution. The Jews had been persecuted in Europe for centuries, and in the 19th century was no different. The first American Jews, who numbered around 50,000 in 1880, had arrived like most immigrants who had come to the United States did during those years, arriving from Western Europe, most of them being of German Jewish descent. In the next 4 decades, however, more than 3 million poverty-stricken Jews arrived from Russia, present-day Ukraine and Poland, and other parts of Eastern Europe. Like other groups, they were searching for economic opportunity, but they were also escaping religious persecution. Here photographed are some of the Jewish immigrants in the United States around the turn of the 20th century. The United States had a lot of qualities that pulled or lured immigrants to our country. The main factors that pulled immigrants to America around the turn of the 20th century was the guarantee of the religious and political freedoms provided by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the economic opportunities spurred on by our incredible Industrial Revolution. In addition, in America, we also had a lot of land, and some of it was wide open for settlement, which was a nice thought for many immigrants who wanted to escape the overcrowding of Europe. These charts show some of the major European countries that experienced significant waves of immigration between the years of 1881 and 1915, and you can clearly see that whether we look at the numbers from Great Britain, Germany, Italy, and especially Sweden, the United States was a popular destination for people who decided to emigrate or leave these European countries. As I previously stated, as we moved into the 20th century, our country saw a shift in European immigration patterns. The old immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe, and the new immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. In these maps, you can see the areas of European immigration represented by red dots. If you look at the key below, you can see that the larger the red dot, the more immigrants it represents. In the map on the left, showing immigration between the years of 1871 and 1880, you'll notice that the European immigrants coming to America in the highest numbers were from the areas like Ireland, England, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden. In the map on the right, showing immigration between the years of 1901 and 1910, you'll notice that there is a shift in immigration patterns. Areas that previously were sending a small number of immigrants to the United States, such as Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, are now sending a larger number of immigrants in comparison to the years before. In the second map, the area of Europe, also known as the Balkans, begin to send immigrants from areas such as Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece. While the maps show that the years between 1901 and 1910 sent us a new type of European immigrant from Eastern and Southern Europe, it is also important to note that if you look at the areas that had the largest numbers on the left between 1870 and 1880, their numbers don't decline in the map on the right. Immigration numbers from areas like Ireland, England, Norway, Sweden, and Germany all stayed steadily the same, while the United States also experienced this massive boom in immigration from other areas. Today our country is referred to as being a nation of immigrants, and this shift in European immigration patterns is one of the major components as to why that is true. The most common way across the Atlantic was by steamship. The steamships were often packed to maximum capacity on board, but the travel experiences of the passengers depended on what type of ticket they had purchased. The ships offered first and second class boarding as well as steerage tickets, which would be how most immigrants would travel across the Atlantic. Most passengers who arrived on these steamships came in steerage class underneath the boat. In steerage you were split into men's and women's quarters. Here you would live in a large room with many bunks or cots and other immigrants. Because of the close and unsanitary conditions in steerage, disease and even death was a possibility. While most immigrants entered through New York Harbor because it was the most popular destination by most major steamship lines at the time, others also sailed into many other ports such as Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Francisco, Savannah, Miami, and New Orleans. The great steamship companies like White Star, Red Star, Cunard, and Hamburg America all played a significant role in the history of Ellis Island and U.S. immigration in general. Upon arrival to New York Harbor, one of the most memorable and relieving sights for immigrants arriving was the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty was gifted to the United States by the French government, and the entire title of the piece is Statue of Liberty Enlightening the World. The statue depicts a woman holding a torch in her raised right hand and a tablet in her left, upon which was engraved July 4th, 1776, the adoption date of the Declaration of Independence. The artist, Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who was said to have modeled the woman's face after that of his mother, hammered large copper sheets to create the statue's skin. To create the skeleton which the skin would then be assembled on, he called on Alexander Gustave Eiffel, designer of Paris's Eiffel Tower. Along with help from other designers, Eiffel built a skeleton out of iron pylon and steel that allowed the copper skin to move independently, which would be a necessary condition for the strong winds of New York Harbor. Construction of the Statue of Liberty began in 1875 and would take years to finish. First they would start with the base, and then they would slowly start to piece the masterpiece together. In these photos you can see some of the various stages of construction. Finally completed in 1886, and the size and scope of the project was truly a testament to the times. The Statue of Liberty stood in New York Harbor to greet millions of immigrants as they arrived on our shores. It stood to watch our nation age, and it stood to watch our nation progress, and it also was there to bear witness to some of our darkest hours as well. She stands today as she stood back then, a symbol of freedom, liberty, and democracy. The base of the Statue of Liberty has a poem titled The New Colossus that was written by Emma Lazarus in 1883. The poem's famous ending reads, "With silent lips give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." While immigrants may have been relieved to see the Statue of Liberty, for most their journey was not yet done. As more and more immigrants began to set sail for America, the government decided that it was necessary to change immigration policies and to create immigration processing centers on the East Coast. Prior to 1890, the individual states, rather than the federal government, regulated immigration into the United States. Castle Garden served as New York State's immigration station from 1855 to 1890, and here approximately 8 million of our old immigrants, mostly from Northern and Western Europe, passed through its doors. Toward the later part of the 19th century, as ensuing political instability and restrictive religious laws and deteriorating economic conditions in Europe began to fuel the largest mass human migration in history, Castle Garden was wrought with problems of corruption, incompetence, and it was super small in size. It soon became apparent that Castle Garden and other state-run facilities like it were ill-equipped and unprepared to handle the growing numbers of immigrants arriving yearly. In New York, the federal government intervened and constructed a newly federally operated immigration station on an island that they had owned in New York Harbor called Ellis Island. Back in 1808, the federal government purchased the island from New York State to build a coastal fortification just prior to the War of 1812. However, after 1892, it would become the most popular and well-known immigration processing center on the eastern United States. First and second class passengers who arrived in New York Harbor were not required to undergo the inspection process at Ellis Island. Instead, these passengers underwent a brief inspection while still on board the ship. The theory was that if the person could afford a first or a second class ticket, they were less likely to become a public charge while in America due to medical or legal reasons. The federal government felt that these more affluent passengers would not end up in institutions, hospitals, or become a burden to the state. However, first and second class passengers were sent to Ellis Island for further inspection if they were sick or if they had legal problems. The scenario was different for steerage passengers. These immigrants traveled in crowded and often unsanitary conditions near the bottom of the steamships, with few amenities and often spending time with sick people while they were crossing the Atlantic. Upon arrival in New York City, ships would dock at the Hudson or East River piers. First and second class passengers would disembark, pass through customs while on the pier, and they were free to enter the United States. The steerage passengers were transported from the pier by a ferry or a barge to Ellis Island, where they would undergo a medical and a legal inspection. The new federally operated immigration structure on Ellis Island opened on January 1st, 1892. Annie Moore, a teenage Irish girl accompanied by her two brothers, entered history and a new country as she was the very first immigrant to be processed at Ellis Island. Over the next 62 years, more than 12 million other immigrants, like this family here, would share her same experience and come through this port of entry on their way to becoming United States citizens. If the immigrants' papers were in order and they were in reasonably good health, the Ellis Island inspection process would last approximately 3 to 5 hours. The inspections took place in the registry room or the Great Hall, where doctors would briefly scan every immigrant for obvious physical ailments. Doctors at Ellis Island soon became very adept at conducting these 6-second physicals, as they began to be called. One of the worst parts of the examination was the eye exam for trachoma, which involved immigration officials to check underneath immigrants' eyelids. Trachoma was a disease that caused blindness. If you went blind or needed to be treated for blindness, you were going to be seen as an undesirable person, as someone who would become a burden to the U.S. government. To perform the test, officials used a button hook, a small metal hook with a wooden handle to peel back the eyelid. The experience was frightening for many immigrants, especially those who were experiencing a language barrier with doctors and nurses. By 1916, it was said that a doctor could identify numerous medical conditions ranging from anemia to goiters to varicose veins just by glancing at an immigrant. Most immigrants would make it through the medical inspections just fine. However, a small group of immigrants would have to be quarantined on Ellis Island, and some were denied entrance and deported back to their homelands. After the medical examination, there was another series of questioning that the immigrants would go through. The ship's manifest log that had been filled out back at the port of embarkation contained the immigrant's name and his or her answers to 29 questions. The document was used by legal inspectors at Ellis Island to cross-examine the immigrant during the legal inspection. Some of the things that legal inspectors were trying to weed out were looking for suspected anarchists or people who would be anti-democratic, and to find any illegal contract laborers that were trying to enter the United States. Despite the island's reputation as an island of tears, the vast majority of immigrants were treated courteously and respectfully, and were free to begin their new lives in America after only spending a few short hours on Ellis Island. Only 2% of the arriving immigrants were excluded from entry. The two main reasons why an immigrant would be excluded was if a doctor diagnosed that immigrant with a contagious disease that they thought would endanger public health, or if a legal inspector thought the immigrant was likely to become a public charge or an illegal contract laborer. With the long journey across the Atlantic complete and the inspection in Ellis Island behind them, these new immigrants were set to start their new lives and their quest for the American dream.